Yeah, welcome to the Writer Center. This is alumni night. I took my first course here a million years ago when it was at Glen Echo. We hadn't even come to this building yet, and then I came back later after an MFA and a book and taught here for 20 years. And Terri was in one of my classes. And apparently I told her, A, you're capable of writing a novel, and B, you've got all these people hanging around, why don't you make them do something? So,
yeah, I can't do it for poetry, so it's really important to write. Yay, you made it. This is Aisha, everybody. So that's that writers group.
I thought Terri was going to read a short selection.
I'll read a little bit. I always like hearing when writers read their stuff because it sounds interesting coming how we phrase it. And then when I finish reading this, I'll tell you a funny story about a reading I did with it. So this is at the beginning, and if you hadn't read it yet, it's Isabel, as the main character, is 11 when it starts. And she lives in a castle, and her best friend is Alain, and Alain is a kitchen boy. And they've run away from the castle, and they're in the orchard where the local villagers are picking the apples. The air was full of bees. Black clots gathered on the fallen apples, fermenting in the heat. Alain stretched in the grass until, in the distance, a woman yelled, "Hellfire, that's Mother!" He stood to run. "Ow!" He snatched up his foot. "Ow, ow, ow!" "Bee sting?" Izzy tossed away her core and laughed. A breeze flirted down the rows of trees. Buzzing filled the air. Alain collapsed, whimpering. "Ow!" He rocked back and forth. Izzy rolled over to him. "Silly, it's just a bee." She grabbed his foot and sucked out the stinger, giggling. Still, Alain cried. "Don't be a baby. I've been bitten 3 times. It doesn't hurt that much." He scratched at his neck, and his fingers, swollen like sausages, stopped her breath. "I can't breathe." His eyes bulged. "Devil got him." A man crashed down from the tree. "See that red on his neck? Mark of the wicked one." Apple pickers began to shout. Women ran toward them, strewing fruit. "The evil beast is here." Fear scrabbled through the words and into Isabel. Was Alain possessed? A girl in the village taken by the devil had been hung. Would the devil jump into her if she touched him? She crawled close to his ear. "Alain, pray the devil away. Pray, pray." He turned his head. His lips, enormous and mottled purple. The baby fuzz on Izzy's arms prickled and she shrieked and tumbled away. "Who are you?" She began to cry. A woman crouched over them. "'Tis the devil, sure." She pointed at Isabel. "You put a curse on him." "'Twas only an apple." Paulus said evil entered the world through an apple. Had the village girl eaten one? Isabel shivered violently. The woman shouted to the others, "See, see, the devil serpent." "I want," Alain choked out, "my mother." Men with large sticks crowded them. "Help him," Izzy begged, but they only shouted more. "A demon spell, wickedness, evil." "Izzy," Alain's tongue writhed like a pink rat. Every itch of her wanted to flee, but she couldn't leave him alone. Praying for safety, she took his hot hand. "She killed the lad." The crowd pressed closer. "Which?" The dreaded word flung out, skittering to Isabel, crawling into her belly. Shudders racked the crowd. Hands snarled. Her young made the sign of the cross. "Witch daughter." She flailed her arms against the bodies, the heat, the noise. Suddenly she was wrenched aloft and swung high, breath gone, unable to scream, mauled by panic. She was to be hung. Thud. She dropped to earth, safe behind a tall back. "Stand away." Hugh, his red curls alight, grabbed the stick and swung it sideways. A man fell to his knees, cursing. "How dare you? She is a count's daughter." Alain's strangled cries burst from his purple mouth. The crowd panted. Hugh pointed the stick at a woman. "The lad needs help. Get his mother." When the woman started slowly away, he raised the stick. "As if it were your own child." The woman ran. He took Isabel's trembling hand and, straddling Alain, held the pole aloft like a sword, hair awry and flaming. "Fall to your knees and pray that he doesn't die. Or if God wants him, pray his whole soul to heaven." In the moment before the word witch reemerged, Isabel felt safe. So the funny story is, I read this reading in Denver, and there was a microphone on a stand. And when I said, "The devil got him," the microphone fell off the stand. It was maybe a sign. And I wrote that scene because I needed to get her out of her castle into her life. And I thought, well, they don't know about these things that could kill. And so they would think it was a witchy thing that she had done. She hadn't really done anything, but the villagers then said, yes, this girl is a witch, and she killed this guy, and, she had to be sent out into the world. So that was my inciting event, if you use that word. I'm not fond of that word, but.
So you need to get something to get it jump-started.
Yeah.
And that got them all moving around. And I was interested in why this queen, when you ran across her, out of all the queens, are the royal people that we know in history, what captured your imagination? Because when you start a novel, you possibly are going to spend more time with that novel than you will in some of your marriages, So, you should be really enraptured with this person. So why were you so captured by her?
Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit. When I went to college, first of all, I had a history teacher in high school that got me hooked into history. I could still tell you some of the things he told me that let me tell you that years ago. But when I went to college, everyone said you should take a class with Dr. Berg. He teaches medieval history. And it was the hardest class I had ever taken, because usually when you have a history class, they give you a history book and it's all laid out for you, this event and this event and this date and this king and so on. Our history book was a series of documents from the period. So we read writs of excommunication, we read about the guilds, and we had to read it, and I think it meant 3 times a week because it was a main class. So we had to read something for the class, and then we came in, and then Dr. Berg would stand up in front and say, well, so how did this affect the people? And it was the first time that I think I learned to think in that class, because I had to extrapolate from what I was reading, how I wasn't terrible at it, but I was fascinated. When I was in high school, I had asked my history teacher, where are all the women? And there weren't any women, and the answer was unsatisfactory to me. So it kind of got me started on that. So I was interested in medieval history. When I started this book, I had 2 shelves of medieval history books. And I also love to travel, and I loved castles, because castles are really neat. And I was at Windsor Castle, and in the bookstore, because you always have to get something, right? And I got a book, and I don't know what the real name of the book was, because I've lost it in all my moves, but it was basically the Picadillos of the royal family. And I was interested in that. That was a little different, And I came to 2 sentences in that book. I was reading it from front to back, but there were these 2 sentences, and it said, King John abducted a French girl, Isabelle Angeline, from France, and took her to England and married her, made her queen. When he died, she went back and married the original fiancé from whom she was abducted. And I couldn't get that out of my mind. Now, I had the book next to me in the John, so I'd read it, but I was, how it goes, we have books to read. And I kept coming back to those 2 sentences, and I just couldn't let them go. And then I went to look her up, and there is nothing about her. Okay, so there's, in the Chronicles, she's mentioned maybe 3 times. She's called a Jezebel, she's called a slut, and she's the Helen of the Middle Ages because there were wars caused over her beauty. So I knew she was beautiful. And I don't know, it made me mad because she was 12 years old when she was married. And that was normal in that time. And I have to back up a little bit about this too, because everyone goes, But the rule was, you could not have sex until the woman had her menses. Okay? And if you did, God would strike you down. And John was in a lot of trouble. He had inherited England from his brother, Richard the Lionheart. And Richard was never around in England. He went off to crusade all the time. He didn't speak English, which I always found fascinating. And when he was coming back from the crusade, he was abducted, and the ransom for him bankrupted the country. So he died a couple of years after he got back, and John took over this bankrupt country. And I lost my train of thought.
Go back to Isabel. We're trying to figure
Okay,
out
yeah. All right, so,
and girls being
yeah, and
told.
girls being mean. So he was on his way to Portugal to meet a princess, to be his second wife. He'd already left off his first wife. And somewhere along the line, he met Isabel. We're not quite sure where he met her. And historians aren't sure why he abducted her, because he lost so much. At the time that he took over England, half of France, the western half of France, belonged to England. And he lost them because the King of France got involved. The barons were mad at him because he was making them pay for money because he was fighting the King of France. And so we don't really know why he abducted them. But my idea was he was in love with her. That was the only thing I could come up with. Because I didn't want him to be a total horrible person. But the writings in the Chronicles reflect more John's reputation than they do on Isabel herself. She was 11, 12. She was a little girl, come on. I mean, they were highly trained at that point. She was trained to be able to manage a castle because they knew she would marry a count or someone with high rank, and that person might go off on the crusades or whatever, and then she'd be in charge of the castle. So she was trained to do all this, and she was an only child. So I let her be educated. It wasn't normal at that time. So I'm going to go back now to being 12 and getting married. I found my way back again. The carousel came around in my head. So John, because he was a bad king and he was in trouble, I was pretty sure he didn't sleep with her. They got married when she was 12. It was the day after her 12th birthday. And she was 17 when she had her first child. So I was able to say, no, this probably didn't happen. He was known to be a philanderer with other women in the court. And I also posited that the people in the court hated her because she wasn't keeping him out of their bed. So, you know, it was just, that's how I came up with that.
So, and when you were doing research, how much could you find? Did she leave anything, any journals or anything?
She did. What I actually found, there's the 3 things in the Chronicles, and there's a letter that John wrote to Terri Lewis, who was a real person. I stuck him in the book. That was really fun. She wrote a letter to Terri. He wrote a letter to Terri, and it's veiled. It says, "Please take care of the treasure I have put you in charge of, and I will see you soon." Not in that language, but that was basically the thing. And historians think that it was that Terri was watching over Isabel, because at that time, England was just falling completely apart. You know, I didn't really realize when the barons revolted and the Magna Carta came in, and John said, "I'm not going to sign this." And then John said, "Okay, I will sign this." And then he signed it, and then he reneged it almost immediately. The barons were colluding with the French, shall we say. And the French were actually in London at one point, just before John died, because he was trying to, you know, keep everything together. And he didn't make it, but the English barons would rather have an English king than a French king, because the son of the French king was in London. And they were waiting for the barons to say, oh, we'll take you as king. And then John died, and it's known that they galloped through the countryside saying, behold your king, you know, he's English, you know. And so gradually they were able to get, yeah, that's true. I read that, so I thought it was interesting. They didn't have, of course, they didn't have newspapers, they didn't have internet, they didn't have any way. And John had an itinerant court. And that means that he didn't live in one place. It wasn't like Windsor Castle where, you know, everything happens. He went from baron to manor to baron, because that's the only way he could show that he was king. And he traveled with this huge retinue of people on horseback, men in carts. They carried his bed with him. And he would arrive, and the people in the castle would have to give up their guest room, and they'd set up his bed for them. And it was an honor to have the king stay, but it could bankrupt you because you had to feed his horses, you had to feed all the people that were with him, you had to provide, and usually he was there to collect rents. You owe me money, so let's look at the, you know, so.
And it's going to cost you a lot for me
Yeah.
to stay here. Right?
Yeah, what a great honor.
What a deal.
So when I did research, there was almost nothing about her. I told you all that I found. And I lived in DC at the time, and I got to go to the
LOC.
the Library of Congress.
Yeah, LOC.
Yeah, and I got to go into the researcher center. I had to go and practically get fingerprinted and sign my life away, and then they let me in. And it was really cool because you just put it out, and then bring, you know, you'd see them walking around and all the stairs, and they bring it down to you. So, but there was nothing. I did read a book about John that was really useful. It talked about he was a really good administrator, and you don't think about that, but Richard was never there. Their father, Henry, lived practically in France. His wife was Eleanor of Aquitaine. The treasury was in Chinon, France. And so part of the problem was that nobody was keeping track of things, so the barons were running things the way they wanted to. But there were, you know, there were laws about courts and how those things had to happen. But when John took over, he never left. He was in France fighting some of the time, but he spent a long time in England looking at what they were doing and making them pay their rents. And so that's why that's what this book said, was why he got such a terrible reputation. So I he actually starved some people to death. Arthur, his nephew, died. You know, you have to balance it out there, but I didn't want him to be totally awful. So I was glad when I read that book. I thought, well, now here's an in. I can make him, you know, really care about his people and try to make things happen, as long as he had the power. So, and then what I found out about Isabel, nothing. So what I did was I built a scaffold. Actually, I had a spreadsheet, tremendous spreadsheet, with all the events of John's king when he was king. And I have dates and times and what was going on, and the Pope did this, and John protested that, and when he was excommunicated, I had all that stuff. So I knew how the timeline was going to run. And then I did research on the social things, because the women would have been involved with that, I think. And I could teach you a medieval dance. I read a whole bunch of medieval poetry. That was a time the Countess of Champagne and another woman were writing what's called lays. And they were the first romantic poetry was coming out. It's also the time when the courtly love ideas were being put out. And they were actually rules. They're written down. I read them. They're in the book. So I thought, well, this is a romantic sort of, it's starting to gather romance around in society. And there was, you know, the knights and all that. And so I thought about, you're not supposed to say this, but I thought about me at 11 and 12. because that's where it started. And at 12, we first started getting interested in boys, you know, and it was, you know, you just played up at that point, like she and I were playing. But at 12 or 11, that was when she met Hugh, and he saved her life and all this stuff. So I figured, well, maybe, you know, she would fall for him in a kind of kid way.
Yeah,
you know,
crushes at that age.
Yeah, a crush, yeah. And so it grew from there. And interesting to me was growing her up. It wasn't like me growing up at all, but I started with that. That was a kernel. Don't tell anybody, said realize, oh, are you in this story? You know?
Because the one thing when I looked her up, it said she was known to have a volatile temper, and then she had 14 pregnancies, which would explain the volatile temper to me.
Well, she had 5 children with John, and she had 9 with Hugh after she left. Yeah. And I know a lot about her. I know a lot about her after she went back to France, and I don't want to write that sequel because I loved her so much in this book. And when she went back to France, she became sort of a harridan. She was a pain in the side of her son, who was now King of England. She demanded all her dowry, which, you know, Richard never gave it to her. He said, oh, I'm giving you Niall, and I'm giving you this, that, and the other thing. But he kept all the rents for himself. That should have gone to her. She was really totally beholden to him. And so when she finally got out and actually married Hugh, we'll talk about that in a minute probably, she was very famous in the Middle Ages. She had a fight with the King of France. She dissed the queen, the French queen, and there was a big battle and she got kicked out. Oh, you know, I don't want to write about her like that because I like her too much. So.
And I was also wondering, I mean, the 2 scenes that struck me is, I mean, I was like, yeah, this one makes sense, but then when she's meeting Hugh, and they had such a big deal about virginity, like we want to know who these kids belong to. So I was just kind of, I was reading that section going, you're gonna lose your head, like what are you doing? And then the rape trial, you know?
Yeah.
And so with those 2 things, I wondered, how did you decide how much freedom to give her? Were those rules, did you find precedent in the historical research, or did you kind of...
Well, you know, part of my theory is that people inherently
do the same.
They have the same hormones.
Yeah.
You know, so you can't say, well, you're shaped by your society, right? But your hormones are the same. So this kind of stuff went on forever. Here's my example, okay. John had a second wife. He was excommunicated by the king. He took all the monies from abbots and everything, and he was basically like that. You know, there's not a person you'd want to know. But he's living in castles that are made out of stone, and they don't have fireplaces until about 1200, which is when the story starts. They have fires in the middle, and the big rooms, and that's how they heat it. So it's very primitive. But the feelings of the people, despite all the church and everything, I'm thinking are close to the same. Okay, you go forward 300 years, Henry VIII. He had a second wife. He was excommunicated by the king. He cut off a lot of heads. But he's living in glorious, you know. So the technology goes like this. It goes forward and forward and forward, and we in the middle, in the technology, basically stay the same because our hormones and so on. The zeitgeist and the thing that surrounds you shapes, you know, like I'm a mountain girl because because I was raised in the mountains. So it makes me a mountain person, but my hormones are nearly the same as you, maybe not you. But So that's how I created her. That's how I made her. Okay, but so the scene with Hugh, when they first started doing it, right? It's a technical term for started doing it.
It's a literary term, yes.
Yes, you may not remember, but she was very, very thin. And when you're very thin, you don't have your period. And so I just posited that, you know, I mean, she was taking a risk, but yeah, she probably didn't have her period, so she'd be okay. And we're talking about the trial when she was almost raped. That was a really important scene to me because when the trial started, Hugh spoke up for her, and the people who were judging her asked her questions, didn't ask her a question, they asked Hugh. So it was man to man. And I was very proud of her when she thought, because, you know, they kind of separate from herself, and she thought, now wait a minute, I was the one that was there, and you're not asking me questions. She stepped forward, and to me that was her first step into being herself, to coming out of being a child. So that's why that happened. You know, I couldn't have her killed at that point, so I had to.
Really the rest of the book, right?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I think sometimes too, when you get the setup right, the character will make these leaps, and sometimes you think that's crazy, but you're guessing right because you've got all the energy going in the right direction.
I call it the magic. When the magic happens, it's just great.
Yeah.
And when I had a magical moment when John first arrived, because I knew that he was coming to the castle. And Lusignan was a really important castle, like 200 years after this novel was set, but I figured it was pretty important at that time for it to have grown as much as it did. If you know Les Très Riches de Duc de Berry, they're the pictures. One of those pictures is of the Lusignan castle. And so I had a vision of it like 200 years in the future. And I don't know.
You have too much information there.
Yeah. But where were we?
The Duc de Berry's,
Yeah,
the castle.
Oh, yeah, when John first appeared, he's riding to that castle. His retinue is behind him, and I knew he had to get there. What is he like? And I heard him growling. And it was like I had his voice in my head. It was such a wonderful moment because I could hear John. I never heard Hugh. Hugh was kind of a sight to me, yeah. I didn't like Hugh that much. She was kind of almost bored. But she liked him, so, you know, you have to let it go. So.
Well, there is that thing that you have to deal with how you fit. In my second book, I changed it to individual narrators because I really hated this one character. And every time when I was writing third person, he would show up and I'd go, look at this bastard. And so I had to let him shoot himself in the foot. I had to let him talk rather than me pointing to how terrible he was. So I think you do those weird choices to get at.
I like him to feel like magic. I do my best writing in the morning when I first wake up, because I'm retired now, lucky me, and I can lie in bed and think about a scene or whatever, and you're in that sort of liminal state, you know, and sometimes I come up with a solution and my gut doesn't agree, and so nothing happens, but if I come up with the right solution, I feel a little breathless, and I know, yeah, this is the way to go. So, I don't know, you know, it's well, most of you are writers, so you probably know what I'm talking about. I hope so.
Do it? Oh.
Yeah.
And so how big a leap did you make from the research to the imaginative? Percentage-wise, how much of this book is imagined, how much is?
The society that surrounds them and the chain of events are all real. So, like I said, it's a scaffold. And Isabella, and she's probably up there going, oh my God, you know, I got to Rome, but she's almost totally imagined. I had to extrapolate knowing what I knew about her in the future and then knowing about how it is to be a young person. So I knew that she had to grow into someone of power. The two things that I did that I think are kind of weird, but I'm glad I did them, was I assumed that she was married to the king. They had to have some kind of relationship. And so her persuading him with sex to let the Pope get his own man and to have the excommunication dropped, that's totally made up. I mean, he did that. He dropped it. I mean, it could have been anything. But to me, you know, when you spend a lot of time, even if you aren't happy with your husband, things happen, you know, there's negotiations going on. So that was one negotiation. And I think I did a second one. Oh, yeah, it was the Magna Carta, when she persuaded him to sign the Magna Carta, and she threw her child in front of him and said, you know, look, do you want to lose this so your son is not going to be king? I mean, if you think about it, that could really happen because it was her son. She would want him to be king, despite the fact that they probably didn't have that much contact, because when the child is born, they don't give him to the mother because they give him off to a wet nurse who will feed them, because if you breastfeed, it delays your conceiving anew, and they knew that. And so it was important to have as many kids as you could. Well, she really did her job there. But
An overachiever, I would say.
yeah, well, interesting to me, 2 of her daughters died in childbirth.
Oh, wow.
So I found that interesting to find out. But anyway, so she wasn't that, she didn't have that first connection with the child. And so of course she left them behind, but she would know that she needed to leave her second son behind in case her first son died, so that the line would continue. And she would leave the daughters behind for her son to use as chips. The women were bargaining chips. I think they were like packages they were handed around. You know, the king would say, oh, you're going to marry so-and-so so I can get some, you know, more land, or you aren't going to attack me if you marry. So, you know, so they had as many as possible because it's a good deal for the men.
So it sounds like you put the historical stuff in as structure, and then the imaginative stuff was like pouring water.
Tell your dog hi. Yeah. So, oh, but I was going to give mea culpa. I told you what I read in those 2 sentences. I found out later they were wrong. She was originally,
Oh my gosh.
She was originally engaged to Hugh's father, who would have been 34, 35 at the time. And I was like 4 drafts in when I found that out. And there was no way I could change it. If I'd known it up front, I could have worked it, but I couldn't. I'd already spent 6 years on this sucker. It wasn't going back. And then I made friends with, she was a historical, she's a member of the Royal Historical Society. I met her online and I said, would you read my book? So she did, which was thrilling to me. And she texted me one day and said, Terri, I imagine you know this. And I said, yeah, I do know. But I said, I found out so late, and I said, there were several sources that I read that said that she went back to her original fiance. And my friend Sharon said, yes, there was some confusion. We're not confused now, but there was. And you know, history always changes as it goes along. So I said, I'll put a mea culpa at the end of the book, which I did, because, you know, I did. But it's so much more romantic than a 14 and a 12-year-old than a 12-year-old and a 33-year-old. I'm sorry. It just made the story better.
Especially now, these days.
Yeah. And I want to say something about historical fiction because I belong to a group, a book club that reads historical things, fiction or nonfiction. And our first book was history, and it was fascinating. It was so interesting. It was 4 kingdoms that made up France in about 400 or maybe a little earlier, and 2 queens who took power and stuff. And I stopped reading a third of the way through because it was not shaped. It was just, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then she killed him, then he killed her, and then you know. And I thought, this is a wonderful story. It needs a fiction writer for it. And I like this is my personal thing, but I like it shaped. I want to know that most of the history in it is true, but I want to have a shaped story. So.
And as a writer, what choices did you make with like language and things like that? Because they would have been speaking Middle English, right? If not Old English?
Well,
French.
They were speaking French and Latin.
That's right.
Richard Lionheart never spoke English. He didn't. he was something. So. Actually, what I decided was I was going to put little tidbits of French in. There's some French words in, because she was French. She would have spoken French and Latin. Now, I allowed her to, I think I told her that I allowed her to be educated because she was an only child. But as a writer, I made some decisions. One of the things I decided was, at that time they wouldn't have used contractions. But the modern person, when you're reading, you want to read contractions. So my rule was they speak without contractions, but the narrative uses contractions, and I tried to keep to that. My second rule was, well, I'm anal about verbs, okay? So I went through, I think most writers are anal about their verbs. That's the spark of the thing. So I went, Merriam-Webster has word history, and I would go and look up a word, so the word for search. And I didn't want to use search, it seemed sort of word. They were searching for something or another. And so I started looking for words that were either of Latinate or French origin, and that were close to the period. Some of them didn't come in until like in 1400. Some of the words weren't used till then. But they were of Latinate, so I could use it. So instead of search, I used ferret. I tried to ferret it out. And I went through a lot of sentences like that, just trying to give it, I wanted to give it a little sense of something different. So you may not have noticed it when you were reading it, but some part of you would have taken it in. And there was a third thing I did, if I could think of it. I think that's enough.
I noticed your verbs, Terri. I thought they
I'm saying that?
I noticed your verbs. I thought.
Or did you notice that?
I kind of sort of verbs. It's good.
Thank you.
I think there was one sentence where you have someone has a feeling that blasts through them, and so I definitely noticed that there was a lot of care.
Oh, I did. I researched swear words. I researched, what they called things. And I try not to use too much French. I try to use it, where it would be, you would understand it in the context. But yeah, I like words. So.
But no, that was a very smart way to do it, where you give the flavor of their speech, but you don't. And I think that's a hard balance when you're writing out of your own time zone, is to get the language where readers get a sense of the characters, but they're not drowning in dialect and all kinds of other stuff.
The best example of how that works well is James. If you've read James, the slave speaks normal language when he's with his own people, and he speaks slave language when he's with the masters. And that was fascinating. It was a really good use of language. I started to say before, I remember something else I did. I hate books that do description and they just throw it at you. Now she went down the road, they went to the left, and there was a big tree there, and da, 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 da. And you're just like, I can't draw this map in my head. So I decided that all the description would come through the character's eyes. So if you go into a castle, like the first time that she went up to Lusignan, she says that it was all white because they'd recently redone it. And it's a long wall like this with two long posts on either side, and she described it, that it looked like laundry hanging out. You know, so you see the white and you see the stretchedness of it. And so I tried to do that when she would show up in different places. When the first time she saw who became her mother-in-law, Hugh's mother, she admired the dress that she was wearing and she wished she had a dress like that. Instead of saying the mother-in-law was wearing a dress with the silver thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important in historical fiction too. So as a reader, you're inside and I was totally inside those characters. I told my husband, if I get Alzheimer and I start telling about people that you never heard of, as my characters. Oh, and I wanted to say about William Marshall. William Marshall is one of my favorite characters. I loved him. And I read a couple biographies about him, and he was as wonderful as I described. The story about the trebuchet, him laughing and making them not kill him, that was in the biography, and I read that and I thought, that belongs in the book. Right. Yeah, he was a fascinating character. Whether they were friends or not, I don't know, but I felt that she needed an ally, and he was the best one. Yeah.
That's good. Was there any portraits of her?
No. There is a death, mask. It's made out of stone, and it's, when I look at it, you can't see who she was in my mind, because she was so active. There's some that are maybe 200 years later. She's always shown with blonde hair, long blonde hair. But interestingly enough, she's buried at Fontainebleau. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but it's with Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry and Richard the Lionheart, and she's buried there. But John is buried someplace else.
But that's interesting.
Yeah, I found that very interesting. But no real portraits. So,
would you like to answer?
yeah, do you have questions?
Yeah, I'd like it if you could tell us where you came up with the beautiful title.
Oh, how I came up with the title. I had decided that the chapters were going to have headings that were quasi-religious, if not, from the Christian. And so I knew that I wanted something that reflected the Christianity on the front cover, because that was so encompassing. I mean, they scheduled their days, their holidays, everything was by the church. And so, behold came to me. And then the birds part, at the very beginning. Okay, so now I'm going to back up a minute. I have a friend who's a poet, and she had edited a book, an anthology of poems, and they were all by women. This was years ago. I loved it, and my favorite poem in that book was about a transport for chickens. They were taking them to market, and there was one chicken whose head was out the side, and it was looking around and as if it wanted to escape and to be free. And so, I don't know, I took that in so that when Isabel was taking care of the chickens and this one chicken kept jumping up, I thought, this is Isabel wanting to be free, and I had her take it into her heart. I had some trouble with that because some of my first readers said, what's with the chicken? And then, of course, at the very beginning, she wants to be a hawk flying free. And there's the geese that when she's at St. Brevel's and she's there waiting for the king to kill her. And so there were always these birds, but she made it out. And so behold, the Berg plot, that's how I got it. But it took forever. I went back and looked all 9 times, there were some real dogs. So,
Yeah, I used to just invite my friends over and give them lots of wine and ask them what to name the book, yeah.
What a great idea for a party.
It was, they're good.
Does anybody else have questions?
How long did this take? Start
10 years.
10 years.
Yeah, but it was in a drawer maybe a year and a half. I just, had other projects, and I said, yeah, And okay, so I went through the whole, you all know about the agent mess, and I went to the black hole of querying, and I got like 10% yeses back, which is really high. I think it was 8.9 or something from all the queries that I did. And I had 3 fulls went out, and all 3 of them turned it down. Loved it, loved the writing, loved the character arc, can't sell it. And 2 of them said to me, we can't sell a book with a 12-year-old who gets married. And I just said, and then someone said to me, make her 16. And I said back, I don't think that works. This is history. It's, these are dates that are kind of set in stone. So that's when I put it away. I said, this is not going to go. And then when I got it out and I looked at it, I said, this isn't bad. I'll fix this up. So, and I had some great critique groups. I'm pretty sure, did you guys read some of it? Yeah. I don't think you guys did. Yeah. So.
Got one in the back.
Hey! Kisses, hugs.
Is there like a scene that's most significant to you or most meaningful to you?
A scene?
Or a plot twist or character?
Well, like I said earlier, I really liked the attack and then that she defended herself. That was a magical moment to me. There was almost no plot twists with John because I knew what happened. I couldn't make up things. When he met, I had a terrible time having him meet Terri the Teuton. How is he going to meet this guy? And then I realized he had mercenary soldiers, so I could have it. And there was a report of a soldier who'd lost his horse, and John helped him out. It wasn't Terri, I don't think, but yeah, good enough. I liked it when she got sick enough, and this surprised me, that she got sick enough and John sent her back to be with her mother. And the mother up to that point had been very cold. I don't know if you remember when she left, she said, you need this knife. And someone said to me, she's going off and they give her a knife? But it was the Middle Ages, So when she goes back and she meets you, and she's been told that she has to go back, John wants her back because of that terrible, that perfidious maid, and she doesn't have any way to tell Hugh that she's not going to meet him again. And that was a surprise to me, the scene with her mother, because her mother up to that point had been, motherly but distant. And I knew that her mother had been married 3 times. And I had already thought, well, maybe her mother had a good marriage. And I was able to take that idea and give them a scene that, I love that scene together. I love when she confides in her mother, and her mother says, because they're getting in bed, she's going, and she says, who is it? And Isabel wasn't aware that her mother knew she was running out to meet this guy. And she said, not some stable boy. And so then it all comes out, and her mother says, and then she doesn't want to talk about one of her earlier marriages must have had, because a lot of those, you were handed along like a package, oh, you're going to marry him. Oh, great, now I have to go to bed with him? You know what I mean? I thought, I can't think of ick. So there must have been, there had to be some marriages that worked out. There was at least carnal attraction, let's put it that way. So that was a surprise to me. That's one of my favorite scenes. Well, I've blathered a lot of it.
The medieval world you're writing about in some ways feels very foreign and very distant. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about why you think this strange story still resonates with contemporary readers. What is it about this story that makes it eternal?
Well, I think it's an important story because it's about the erasure of, in this case, a single woman. But more and more as we go back in history, we're finding that this has been going on for a long time, especially in the sciences. And so I wanted to there's two things I wanted to do. I wanted to bring her back. But I also wanted you to be able to see parallels between power and how power corrupts. I mean, it doesn't matter what age you're in, corruption happens. And what I was describing about the kings down the line, I hope this won't offend anyone, but look around. We have all this technology, but the hormones and the need for power and so on stay the same. And I would hope that even subconsciously you would read about this and say, oh, I would have hated to have lived then, but I can see some parallels. That was my hope. And it's just a tiny little drop in the sea of things that have gone slightly schief, shall we say, in German, slightly sideways. So, I don't have any delusions that this will change anything, but, I hope that it will open your eyes. And also to the idea that, they were real people back then. And when you study history, you don't learn that. All you learn is kings and popes and wars, and there's the serfs and the slaves over there, but they're real people. So, and more women are writing about this, and it's important. So get out there.
Well, especially timely now, because we're doing this thing about we should all be barefoot and pregnant again. I mean, we're doing a big slide back in terms of women's rights. So, yeah. You had a question back
Yeah, I was going to say, so you put this book down for your 2 years. How did it change when you returned to it? Or how did you see it differently or react, see the story differently at all? Or?
Yeah. I was very late coming to the idea of plot. Plot is never important.
Make something happen.
It's funny, I was telling my friends, the first story I ever remember writing, I was in 6th grade, I think, and I was sitting with my cousin in our kitchen, and we were each writing a story, and I wrote the story, and my cousin wrote a story, and she read it, and lots of stuff, and then my mother read my story, because I was going to read out loud, and my mother said, honey, this is really nice writing, but nothing happens. That was it. So it took me a long time to get the plot. So I think in that time period, because I've written now 7 novels, I think, and in that time period I started to catch on. After a while you start to catch on if you keep trying. And I was writing short stories and so on. So I think when I took that out, even now, I don't think it exactly starts in quite the right place. I was sorry there wasn't more tension at the very beginning. It seems like it takes a little while to get past her to Alan. And I should have made it more so you felt like there was something coming. I added 2 sentences. They let me add 2 sentences after the proofread, and that was about it, because I couldn't.
Yeah, change too much.
Yeah, I was going to ask about just the editing process and how somebody looking.
I'm sorry?
The editing process. I just wanted to ask about how long, what's it like? Like, did you, once you had kind of your finished draft, how much did you end up going back to change?
Lots,
Yeah.
lots.
And how long?
It took me years to learn that I can pull out a whole hunk and throw it away. You know, you never want to throw it away, at least in my mind. Once I get it down, it's like I've memorized it. The words are great up here. And to get rid of it, it took me years to learn. Well, just get rid of it, you know. It could come back if you need it. And I hate first drafts. I'm a 200 words a day at the very most writer. So it just takes forever. But once I get there, I love to edit. And for a while, editing made making good sentences and making, you know, the scene come alive and stuff. But now editing to me means, well, this doesn't really belong in this story. But it takes a while to, you know, get there, and I'm not always there. So I made my drafts, so Isabel 1, Isabel 2, Isabel 3, until I got to about 15. And then I go to new Isabel 1, new Isabel 2. And I have acres of drafts. I'm just real anal about that, because you know, you never know. Sometimes I'll think, oh, I could really use that little bit, and then I have to search through acres of things, but usually I can find it. So I like editing. I enjoy editing. It's easier than drafting. Yeah.
I read a couple years ago Keith Hayman's memoir, Heavy, where he one of the thing that stuck with me most is what he says about revision, because he says revision is his religion. That it is like not just your stories, but your life is in a constant state of revision. And you can put out a book and publish it, that doesn't mean that it's done. And I think I read that he wrote he wrote a book and published it, and then he like revised it and published another version of it.
Yeah.
I have to look at that, but
I
don't know how I feel about that, but I do think there's a lot of wisdom in it.
I was at a reading with Rebecca Makkai, and she, you know, the book had been out for maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and she was reading along, and she stumbled over a word, and she said, oh, that word is wrong, it should have been such and such. So, you know, you're never quite there, I think.
Yeah, Ernest Lessing used to rewrite novels after they were published. He had a really patient wife that would do, no, because they do go on. You should never pick up a piece of your writing where you don't see something that you could make better. You can tighten the language or make it sharper, so yeah.
I got my proofread today for my next novel, and I started going through it, and oh, there's one section. I had to write it new because it won this prize, but I had to change the ending. And there's one section that's not in the right voice, and I don't think they're going to let me change it. I want to change it, so it goes along, and then there's this, and then it goes along, and it's right. I got back in the voice to change the end, but that one section, and I'm going to have to write to them and say, Jody, and I think it's going to be a no. You know, I put in some sentences that I can do without, you can't overrun the page because it's paginated now.
Yeah.
But so I have another novel coming out in 27, and it's set in ballet, the world of ballet. Are you surprised? But I'm saying about it, it's about choice. It's about women's choice. That's how I'm going to place it, otherwise I'd get in a lot of trouble. Yeah.
What would teenage Terri, who was dissatisfied with that history class, think
Wait, say
about?
again?
What would teenage Terri, who was dissatisfied with that history class, or at least the answers about women in history, say about this book?
Yeah. I try to push back. You know, it wasn't just women. I asked about women, but I was always bothered. You don't hear about the peasants either. You know, and they're the backbone on which all this stuff is living. And it always bothered me that, you know, there were peasants and they were you know, they were serfs, they were slaves of a sort, and then, you know, they kowtowed. Their lives must have been horrible if you really think about it. You know, and John was living in this pile of stones. It was a castle, it was a pile of stones, but it was stone. It wasn't made out of reeds, and it didn't fall down and leak, and if there was a fire in the middle and it caught, you know, that's a part of other people's lives that interests me. I was always interested in that. History, yeah, well, history's okay. I don't want to memorize any dates. I can look up a date. I don't want to know the king's names. I can look that up. I want to know about the people. So I've had to invent a lot. Obviously, I have no compunction.
You have time to sign books now.
Oh, yeah, anybody want a book signed?
There are refreshments in the back.
Did you have something?
No, it's not.
Oh,